Welcome to our course, Frank Lloyd Wright and the 20th Century. My name is John LaBelle. I'm a professor of architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. I studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania with such architects as Louis Kahn and Robert Venturi, and I wrote a book on Louis Kahn's philosophy titled Between Silence and Light. So, why a course on Frank Lloyd Wright? Wright is generally regarded as one of the most important architects of the 20th century, so let's briefly list some of the reasons for this assessment. First, many of Wright's buildings simply are beautiful. To this day, many who own Frank Lloyd Wright houses find it a joy to live in them. But more importantly, as we will see as we make our way through this course, Wright was at the center of many of the defining movements of the 20th century. We see his ideas reflected in modern art, for example, in Cubism and in Mondrian, in literature, for example, in the novels of James Joyce, Marcel Proust, and Virginia Woolf, and in physics in Einstein's relativity. And finally, Wright developed an approach he called organic architecture, which included an integration with nature, an idea of growing importance to us today as we seek sustainability in our own architecture. Wright was born in 1867 and died in 1959, so he lived to the age of 91, and his life spanned the end of the 19th century and the entire first half of the 20th century. He was born just 2 years after the end of the American Civil War. By the time he died, we were in the modern world of electronic communications, atomic energy, and satellites. He responded to that world, but he also held on to the values of the Emersonian world into which he had been born. The first house that Wright did on his own, the Winslow House, had stables in the back. One of his last projects was a proposal for a mile-high building with atomic-powered elevators. So you can see this tremendous span of the development of the 20th century through which Wright lived. Wright's career was long, and he was responsible for over 500 completed projects throughout the United States. After some early houses, he developed his Prairie Style, as we see in his Roby House of 1909 in Chicago. Here we see the low-sloped overhanging roof, open plan, interpenetration of inside and outside, and massive chimney core that came to characterize the American suburban house of the 1950s and 60s. In the 1920s, Wright did a series of concrete tile houses, beginning with the Millard House in Pasadena, California. Here he shows us the concrete construction of the house in contrast to the Corbusier's use of stucco to cover the structural tiles in his Villa Savoie. Wright's career had its ups and downs. After a long period without work, he did Falling Water near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which epitomized his approach of integrating his house with nature, and which brought him worldwide recognition. Around the same time, he did a design for the headquarters for Johnson Wax, which presented a new vision of the office workplace. And finally, in the 1950s, he did a series of remarkable projects culminating in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. The Guggenheim was the final manifestation of his vision of space, and he wrote, "Space, the continual becoming, invisible fountain from which all rhythms flow and to which they must pass, beyond time or infinity." Frank Lloyd Wright was born about 150 years ago, so throughout this course we will be asking, what can we learn from Wright about how we should be engaged with the technology and culture of our time? Wright responded to the new materials of his time, particularly concrete. what are the cutting-edge materials of our time, and how should the architecture of today respond to them? Wright's Prairie Style responded to changes in family life and to the emergence of the American suburb. What are the corresponding changes in our time, and how should our architecture respond to them? Wright's work influenced modern art. What is the relationship of today's architecture to today's art? And there were parallels between Wright's architecture and Einstein's relativity. But that was the physics of 100 years ago. What is the physics of today, and how does it relate to our architecture of today? In looking at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum of 1959 in New York City and Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Museum of 1997 in Bilbao, Spain, we can ask, what was Wright's relationship to the 20th century, and how should we today be relating to our emerging 21st century? I'm looking forward to the rest of the course with you.